Hello and welcome. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our top stories. Syria's Interior Minister says that violent clashes in the Druze majority city of Sweida have now halted after reports of further unrest. Israel and Syria have agreed to a US-brokered ceasefire after Israeli military action over the sectarian violence. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that Kyiv has offered a new round of direct talks with Moscow for next week as the Russia-Ukraine war continues to rage on. Intensifying aerial attacks from both sides come amid continued calls for a truce. The reported death toll from Israeli attacks on Gaza aid sites yesterday has now risen to 39, according to the Gaza Civil Defense Agency. Questions have been raised by humanitarian groups over the safety of GHF aid sites in Gaza following potentially hundreds of casualties. A man has been charged with assault with a deadly weapon. This follows an incident in LA where a car drove into a crowd of people outside of a nightclub. Dozens were injured, with many in a critical or serious condition, according to local emergency services. Japanese citizens are heading to the polls with voting in the tightly contested upper house election. In a key test for Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, the potential for a loss of LDP-led coalition majority could lead to political instability. At least 10 people have died, with others still missing after heavy rainfall leading to flash flooding and landslides in South Korea. Search and rescue operations are ongoing, with fears that the death toll could continue to rise. The death toll in Vietnam after a tourist boat capsized has now risen to 37 people, with 5 still missing. The Wonder Sea boat was carrying 48 passengers and 5 crew on a tour of the popular Halong Bay when the incident occurred, that according to reports. And Ukrainian boxer Alexander Usyk has further cemented himself as a boxing all-time great after unifying the heavyweight division for a second time, following a devastating win over Daniel Dubois in London. The British fighter was overwhelmed and stopped in the 5th round. We start this hour in the Middle East, and fighting in Syria's southern city of Sweida has reportedly ceased after Druze fighters recaptured the city, pushing out rival factions. The Syrian Interior Ministry confirmed that tribal fighters have evacuated and clashes in the city have stopped following a ceasefire agreement brokered by the United States. This agreement also aims to avert further Israeli military intervention in the region. The violence in Sweida, which has left more than 900 people reportedly dead in sectarian clashes, saw Israeli airstrikes earlier this week targeting Syrian government forces accused of atrocities against Druze civilians. While the ceasefire has restored control to Druze fighters in the city, tensions do persist as fighting has continued in other parts of the province. Meanwhile, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has called on Syria's security forces to prevent jihadist groups like ISIS from entering the region. Well, further instability, but optimism over this ceasefire and calls from the US as well as within the region. Joining us to discuss those, Shruti Dasgupta, an international affairs expert who is joining us live from New Delhi. As always, Shruti, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. This situation is, of course, a complex one. A ceasefire is holding, it seems, but tensions still flaring up. Let's look at the actual fighting that has been happening. Reports of Druze fighters regaining control of Sweida. How significant is that news if peace is going to last in a region that has seen hundreds of deaths due to sectarian violence?
Greetings, Joshua. Thank you for inviting me. I understand that the Druze fighters have been very, very strong in their attempts to ensure that their very micro-minority community is not wiped out under the hands of the Islamists and jihadists that have taken control of large parts of Syria. Al-Shara, as a former Al-Qaeda member and a Muslim Brotherhood advocate, it has been placed by the US to control these very groups that were being utilized by Iranian proxies to ensure that Syria stays not favorable towards Israel. So now Israel had attacked, as you have previously mentioned in your report, and that had led to the Syrian authorities to take it a little more seriously. And when the US stepped in and said that please ensure that this does not turn into an ISIS zone where sectarian violence in the form of jihad is continued, then Al-Shara had to make out that announcement and calling for ceasefire. So, but although if you follow social media or any other form of communication, you'll find that there are spates of firing happening all around. And this is not just targeted towards the Druze, it is also targeted towards the Syrian Christians. And the Greek Orthodox Church has also issued a worldwide appeal for help in the Sweida region as well. So you can understand that this is as much as an ethnic cleansing as a sectarian violence as has been presented by the Syrian authorities.
Yes, and Shruti, let's look at that US intervention, of course taking part in brokering this ceasefire deal, but also Marco Rubio pushing the Syrian government to make sure that this violence is stamped out and avoided where possible. Why do you think the US is so heavily involved in at least the diplomacy of this sectarian violence and the situation in Syria? Of course, we saw sanctions lifted, a meeting between Ahmed al-Shara and Donald Trump in the Arab states. This really is a point which the US are looking at. Can you explain why?
Well, that's an excellent question. And the US is completely involved in the regime change that happened in Syria. The Alawites, that were a minority group of Syria, was led under Assad regime, and that Assad regime was more loyal towards the Russian factions, and via Russia through more loyal towards Iran. That entire scenario was disrupted by this regime change, and they've done exactly what they did in Afghanistan. They've placed a man in uniform, taken him out, changed his name from Al-Jalani to Al-Shara, and put him on the seat of power, hoping that they can control the narrative as well as the flow of ideology in the nation. But as I've said before, you can take a man out of uniform, but you cannot take him out of the ideology that he follows. This is exactly why the US is interfering. One is that they were responsible for what is happening. The deaths of the Christians is on US. The deaths of the Druze is on the US. The deaths of Alawites is on the US. This is not a Sunni versus Shia. This is basically Muslim Brotherhood taking over the ideology via the man that US themselves shook hands with. So this is one of the reasons. The other reason is if Israel becomes more aggressive and this becomes a third war that Israel has to fight in the Middle East, not just for its survival, but to ensure that another terrorist group does not take over Syria, which will have to face off later on in its entire fight for existence in the Arab world. This is the second reason why the US is interfering. So they placed a man in uniform in power. They shook hands. They called him a tall, strong, beautiful, handsome man. But he was, as before, an incarcerated Al-Qaeda Muslim Brotherhood man. And he's just making sure that the optics of the war looks good when he calls for ceasefire, while his own government officials are completely complicit in this ethnic genocide happening in Syria.
Shruti, very briefly before we move on, what comes next? A fragile truce somewhat holding, but reports of further violence taking place in the region. Also, you alluded there to Israeli involvement in this conflict and potential escalation. How do you see this playing out over the coming weeks and months?
Well, peace through power is the only way that Syria is now going to watch any peace. So I believe the Druze will have to be armed, the Christians will have to be armed. There's not going to be peace without the barrel of the gun pointing at the heads of the Sunni Islamist jihadist regime that has been placed by the US. The US will have to keep its pressure on, and lifting sanctions or allowing more power to flow through the hands of Al-Shara is not the way to go through it. So my assumption is that the US should be closely monitoring it, while Israel should be helping to arm the people that are actually facing off the gunfire in Sweida and other regions.
Shruti Dasgupta, thank you ever so much for taking the time to discuss this complex topic. We will continue to bring you all the developments from Syria as we get them. Now we stay in the Middle East but shift over to Gaza, which continues to face a humanitarian crisis as the death toll due to reported Israeli fire at Gaza aid sites on the 19th of July has now risen to 39. The incident occurred in the southern Gaza areas of Khan Yunis and Rafah, where people were desperately waiting for food aid. The Israeli military claims it fired warning shots after encountering suspects near the aid sites. Meanwhile, thousands of Israelis in Tel Aviv have marched to the US Embassy. They have been calling on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and US President Donald Trump for a comprehensive hostage deal that would end the war and bring hostages back. Doron Steinbrecher, a former hostage of Hamas, has walked in the march. This is what he and Ruby Chen, father of the slain hostage Itai Chen, has said.
President Trump, we've met and spoken. I know how personally important this is to you, how deeply involved you are, and I know what you are capable of. Make it happen. Let everyone pass through the gates of hell so that we may rise, so that we may heal.
Only President Trump can bring the voice that says, enough waiting, enough bullshitting. Enough. Now is the time to end the suffering and bring a deal that all the hostages, all the 50 hostages are able to come back. And there will be consequences for those responsible for the collapse of the deal. We ask President Trump, lean in, use your power, show the world that freedom matters and that every life counts.
We move away from the Middle East now, and in Japan, voters are heading to the polls today in a high-stakes upper house election that could determine the future of Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's leadership. Some voters highlighted their concerns. Let's first have a listen to what they said.
私は年金所得者なので生活をしています。なので今どんどん年金が下がってきてしまっているので、まあ払ってる方もたくさん、私たちも払ってきましたけれど、そこが一番厳しいかなとちょっと思う。
今からのこの先の経済というところと、今の国民の生活の状況をどう変えていただく。
Well, with half of the 248 seats up for election, the Liberal Democrat Party and Komeito need to secure at least 50 seats to maintain their majority. But low public support and recent setbacks have put the coalition on shaky ground. Japanese media warns that the coalition is unlikely to meet its target, raising questions about the future viability of Ishiba's government. Well, we do welcome Dr. Satoru Nagao, a fellow at the Hudson Institute from Tokyo, Japan, on the programme to discuss this election and its significance as Japan heads to the polls. Dr. Nagao, as always, thank you for joining us. Let's just look at the overall significance of this vote. Of course, it's an upper house vote. A proportion of seats are up for grabs. But why is it so key for Ishiba and Japanese politics that this vote goes their way?
Yes, this is very important because last time in the lower house elections, the ruling party has already lost the majority. So now the ruling party, Liberal Democratic Party, cooperate with the other opposition party to form the government. But now the upper house election is coming. So, and there is a possibility that the ruling party will lose the majority in the upper house too. So in the both lower house and upper house, there is a possibility ruling party lose the majority. In this case, such kind of the situation will affect the attitude of the opposition party. If opposition party will not cooperate with the current ruling party, Liberal Democratic Party, the government will change. And if the government will maintain the ruling status, but still the ruling party, Liberal Democratic Party, need to concede more to the opposition party. It is expected. That's why this election is very important to change the attitude of the current government, Japanese government. But that will happen, people expected. That's why this is very important.
Yes, and Dr. Nagao, what is the impact of geopolitical situations like the ongoing wars, tensions, of course, around the South China Sea and wider region that impact Japan, but also Trump's tariffs? How is that playing a part potentially in these elections?
This election will affect very much because of the leadership of the current government. If the current Ishiba administration losing the leadership, losing the power of the leadership in the parliament, he cannot decide something bold. For example, in the negotiation with the United States, even if the current Ishiba government want to concede more, but without the support from the opposition party, they cannot implement it. So that's why the agreement is rely on the opposition party. So same things could happen when the Japan face China. So without persuading the opposition party and the ruling party at the same time, the prime minister cannot decide anything. This means that Japan's decision-making demand more longer time to decide something. That is important. So Japan cannot show the strong leadership because the lack of the majority in the parliament. That will happen. And that will happen not only in the lower house, but also the upper house. That is a concerning point in the geopolitically.
Yes, and Dr. Nagao, to bring an end to our discussion, can you provide some context on public opinion and why there has seemingly been a shift and what you think that could mean for these elections? Of course, results are not yet out and we await those, but predictions and polls have given a narrative.
This is important in this view from the current flow of the situation. The price rise will affect the result of the election, I think, because for example, the price of rice is representative of the price rise. Last 1 year, the price has nearly becoming the double. So in the April 2024, that was $13 per 5 kilogram. In April this year, this is $26. So that is the situation. So completely double. So and after that, the Ishiba administration's agriculture minister faced a scandal because despite such kind of situations, he said he haven't bought any rice because many people present him. So that was the scandal and he resigned. So under the new agriculture minister, who is a very famous and popular young politician, Shinjiro Koizumi, who could be the alternative of the Prime Minister Ishiba in the future. But under him, the price was becoming a little bit lower and people enjoyed this situation. But still, the price is relatively high because 5 kilogram is $23.5. So this means that compared with $13 1 year ago, not double, but a little bit moderate, but high. So that's why under such kind of situation, view from the flow of the situation, the current government faces a tough situation. People do not want to support the current government. That's why ruling party is losing the majority in the upper house also.
Yes, Dr. Nagao, you will be staying with us, and of course here on NewsX World we will bring you all of the updates from that upper house election in Japan as we get them. But we move on now, and the death toll from Saturday's tragic boat capsize in Vietnam has now risen to 38, with 5 others still missing. That according to local authorities. The Wonder Sea boat carrying 48 passengers and 5 crew members capsized during a sudden thunderstorm during a sightseeing excursion in the Halong Bay. According to reports, rescue workers have saved 11 people's lives and recovered the bodies of the deceased near the site of the capsizing. Authorities have since revised the figure after earlier reporting that 12 people had been rescued. Local media reported that most of the passengers were tourists from Hanoi, including around 20 children. This comes as a tropical storm is also moving towards the area. A national weather forecast has said that Storm Whipper is expected to hit Vietnam's northern region next week, including Halong Bay's coast. Well, Dr. Nagao, thank you for staying with us to look at this tragic incident. Of course, the specific circumstances that led to this capsizing is difficult to talk about, but briefly, I just want to touch on the wider safety in this region of the world, which of course is a tourist hotspot as well. Do you think questions should be raised about specific checks that are being done on these boats, small boats, but also potentially on what times these boats are going out with tourists and children on board?
Yeah, unfortunately, this was not prepared well, people need to say, because accident could happen, so preventing accident is one thing, but another one is even if the accident has happened, these crew and passengers should be rescued. If, for example, if there is number of the enough rescuing system to flow the water, this equipment should be prepared in each ship. But so many number has dead means that there is a possibility they haven't prepared enough. It is clear, and how many passengers can stay in the ship is also matter. If this is too many, because of the too many, it has sinked. So that's why the accident could be avoided, but they haven't prepared enough. That's why such kind of tragedy has happened. That is a very important problem, I think.
Yes, Dr. Nagao, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with us on both topics. We will bring you further updates on the tragic capsizing in Vietnam as we get it. But we move now to Europe, and in a significant development, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced that Kyiv has extended a formal offer to Moscow for a new round of peace talks next week. Speaking during his nightly address, Zelensky emphasised the urgent need for a ceasefire. Let's listen to those comments.
Також секретар РНБО Умєров доповів, що запропонував російській стороні наступну зустріч на наступному тижні. Переговорну динаміку треба збільшувати. Треба робити все, щоб досягти припинення вогню. І російській стороні треба перестати ховатись від рішень. Обмін полонених, повернення дітей, припинення вбивств. І потрібна зустріч на рівні лідерів, щоб реально забезпечити мир. Дійсно, тривалий. Україна готова до такої.
Well, the proposed talks would be the third round between the two nations in Istanbul over the past few months. While previous meetings resulted in prisoner exchanges, no substantial progress has been made towards ending the war now in its fourth year. Rustem Umerov, recently appointed head of Ukraine's National Security and Defence Council, delivered the latest proposal. Umerov led Ukraine's delegation in earlier negotiations, is now tasked with accelerating the peace process despite signals of openness to talks. Russia continues its offensive in the Donetsk region and has not shifted from its broad war demands. Well, joining us to discuss this latest proposal, potentially move towards peace, Madhav Nalapat, editor of the Sunday Guardian, joining us from New Delhi. Thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with us. There is, of course, optimism here from Ukraine, but as we know, Western allies of Ukraine and Ukraine themselves have been pushing for a 30-day ceasefire For month upon month upon month, Russia has consistently said no. Is this just Ukraine chancing their luck, or do you think there could be a move towards potential peace with this latest offering of talks?
Look, I'd like to say that from my sources in Washington, the Trump administration has decided that Zelensky is not a partner in peace, that Zelensky will have to go before peace can come in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian people are saved more suffering. The fact is that Putin said he needed 60 days, 60 days, to complete the operation in Ukraine, whatever that means. Well, after 10 days, Trump has given him an additional 50 days. So what does 50 plus 10 add up to? 60 days. So he's got the 60 days he needs. And Zelensky knows that, and he's anxious to stop that, and he's anxious to have a ceasefire. I don't believe the Russians are going to stop firing so long as Zelensky is the president, one, and two, until they finally ensure that Ukraine is completely in a position where they want it to be. For that, Putin had himself said that they need 60 days. Well, he's got the 60 days from President Trump. Now, the Europeans can step in and do what they like, and frankly, the Americans are sitting pretty because the Europeans are spending the money and the Americans are collecting the cash and sending weapons to Ukraine, which of course Ukraine is using. For example, the Donetsk region today, there was a very deadly Ukrainian missile attack using American HIMARS and very advanced systems, and it did considerable damage. But the reality is that Zelensky now knows that the Americans don't regard him as a partner in peace, whereas the Europeans cling on to him as a partner in their ceaseless, and if I may say so, senseless quest to basically weaken Russia to the extent to which it becomes necessary for Putin to go. That from the beginning I have said of this war that it's not going to happen, that the Ukrainians are fighting a losing battle, and now you have reports that Zaluzny, Commander Zaluzny, who 1 year ago was sacked because he wanted a ceasefire, he said, I don't want to shed any more Ukrainian blood. Let's stop this shedding of blood. Let's stop further encroachment into our territory. And Zaluzny was sacked. And now I'm told that there's a very strong view in Ukraine that Zaluzny should come back. So some of the latest polls say that about 69% of the Ukrainian voters want Zaluzny. What does that mean? They want peace. And Putin has got his 60 days. The Europeans he's sitting pretty as far as Donald Trump is concerned, and he's sitting pretty. He is making money. The Europeans are spending the money, and eventually European taxpayers are going to ask, what are we spending all this money for? Because all the money they're spending, a lot of that is now ending up in American weapon supplies. The Americans are demanding cash on the dollar for every weapon supplied. Nothing is free. The Europeans are providing the cash, and the Americans are providing the weapons. And that's been seen as a big quote-unquote breakthrough. There's no breakthrough. There's not going to be any peace so long as Zelensky is there, is what the Americans feel, and frankly what the Russians feel. And they're going to continue with this offensive for as long as it takes. If it takes as much as 50 days more, 50 days more. But they're not going to stop until they've achieved the objectives in Ukraine. And in the meantime, there's a groundswell that Zelensky must resign. And as I said, Zaluzny is very popular. 1 year ago, he was sacked. Now, Zelensky has sacked some of his key lieutenants, some of his key ministers in a desperate bid for survival. But I think, frankly, what he's headed for is exile. And I think Zaluzny will come. And then there will be a
Madhav
peace
Nalapat,
deal.
unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you ever so much for joining us and providing that insight there. We do move on briefly to North America, where a driver has been charged with assault This comes after a car ploughed into a crowd outside of a Hollywood nightclub, injuring 30 people on Saturday. This according to police. According to the authorities, the bystanders attacked and shot the driver before he was detained. LAPD spokeswoman Rosario Cervantes has said that the suspect, identified as 29-year-old Fernando Ramirez, was charged on suspicion of assault with a deadly weapon. As per reports, Ramirez had been kicked out of the Vermont Hollywood nightclub in East Hollywood before the car rammed into a crowd. Ramirez has reportedly been undergoing surgery at a local hospital after suffering a gunshot wound from the incident. Here is what the LA authorities have had to say.
That we have 30 victims, 18 females and 12 males between the ages of the mid-20s to early 30s. 7 are reported in critical condition, 6 in serious, 10 minor, and 7 signed out against medical advice. The suspect in this case reportedly struck the crowd, and the crowd surrounded him, pulled him out of the vehicle, and tried to detain him for law enforcement. But while that was occurring, we received reports that somebody in the crowd shot him. And he was transported to the hospital. He's undergoing surgery. He is in stable condition. However, he is not free to leave. He is in the custody of Los Angeles Police Department, and we're looking at charges such as attempt murder and assault with a deadly weapon at this point.
Well, that is all we have time for, but we will continue to bring you more of the latest breaking news from across the world. Thank you.